Excellent. Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We have some guests, an audience here, and 3 presenters for the 2021 American Literature Association panel from the Society for the Study of American Travel Writing. I am Shealeen Meaney from Russell Sage College, and I will be just introducing our panelists and our papers and helping to organize our questions at the end. I hope that everyone's excited and find some interesting material here. I know that I did. So this is the only Society for the Study of American Travel Writing panel that we are having this year. I am really grateful that despite COVID and lots of cancellations and lots of confusion, we did wind up with some stalwart scholars who are still working through the year here and ready to present some scholarship for us. Our topic for today is ethical encounters, fairly broad, and just constantly recurring issue in travel studies and travel writing. So I'm really excited to see the different directions that our scholars take this in. We're going to start out with Professor Susan Roberson from Texas A&M University-Kingsville. Susan's publications are many, include Emerson and his Sermons, A Man-Made South, Antebellum American Women and the Road, American Mobilities. And the work she's going to share today is actually part of a book-length manuscript called Geographies of Travel, which is about 19th century American travel writing about America. Of course. So that's going to give things over to Susan. And
is my one little PowerPoint slide showing?
It is.
All right, I just did this one little slide just for a visual. All right, so shall I start then?
Please do.
All right.
Susan's work is titled Constance, Fenimore, Woolson, and the Ethics of Sightseeing. So thank you, Susan.
All right. So in the Ethics of Sightseeing, Dean McCannell argues that the ultimate ethical test for tourists is whether they can realize the productive potential of their travel desires or whether they allow themselves to become mere ciphers of arrangements made for them. In other words, are tourists, sightseers, able to see beyond the attraction to think about themselves, the environment, and the people they visit, and to contemplate the larger society both they and the tourists represent? If, as John Urey argues, the tourist gaze is a good way of getting at just what is happening in the normal society, then what does tourism tell us about normal society? In Constance Fenimore Woolson's hands, that normal society is self-absorbed, unmindful of the cost of industrialization, history, and colonization. By examining 2 travel narratives by Woolson, Round by Propeller, about travel around the Great Lakes, and The Ancient City, about travel in St. Augustine, Florida, both cast as short stories with a crew of traveling characters, we can see how Woolson uses her narratives to critique thoughtless, careless tourists and the society that they represent. For Round by Propeller, Woolson invents a first-person narrator, Aunt Rue, who tells the story of the Great Lakes excursion and comments rather sardonically about the goings-on of her fellow travelers and the destruction of the natural landscape by careless industrialization. Published in the same year that Yellowstone Park was established as the first national park, 1872, and 3 years before Mackinac Island would be named the second national park, 1875, Round by Propeller can be read, Victoria Bram claims, as a travel narrative cast as environmental Jeremiad. At a time when the nation was just beginning to understand the need to set aside parcels of wilderness for public enjoyment, even as it promoted industrialization as a sign of progress, Woolson fuses the rhetoric of the Jeremiad to her travel writing to expose the damage to the natural environment and critique the national ethic of use in an early example of ecofeminism. When Woolson's tourists arrive in Cleveland, they are greeted by a cloud of smoke produced by the iron mills and oil refineries shrouding the city. Rather than go out onto the prairies to see the wildflowers, as other visitors to the Midwest had done, these tourists are eager to see the built and industrialized environment, despite the gray sky that greets them. Deciding to tour the oil refineries, the narrator and Major Archer, another excursionist, view firsthand the refining process and the pollution of the flats, the Cuyahoga River, and the Ohio Canal. Compared to the cauldrons of hell with its choking odors, sulfurous in origin, and shimmering crude green petroleum, the refinery, marked by rows of stills and pipes, is a parable of the commercial destruction of the environment. The allusion to hell is continued as the river is described. The pollution has transformed the clear stream of the Cuyahoga into a river that is more petroleum than water, and that earlier took fire and fairly blazed as it flowed down to the lake. Even though the risk from fire and explosion is great, Major Archer explains that fortunes are being made from the oil business. Woolson reads the destruction of the environment in biblical terms, with references to Judgment Day, hell's sulfurous cauldrons, and original sin. In Jeremiadic fashion, she figures the pollution as both a cosmic and a national problem, implying the environmental destruction as a portent of human punishment to come. If the traditional Jeremiad threatens punishment in order to revitalize the original errand of America, Woolson's Jeremiad seeks to conserve a pastoral landscape and ideology against the ruthless consumption of the post-Civil War era. As Sack Van Berkovich has pointed out, the American Jeremiad joins politics, ideas of sacred and secular progress, and national identity to suggest an ideology of American exceptionalism. But for her, that identity is not one of exceptionalism, but a promise is broken. Not only has the landscape been changed over the years with industrialization, the growth of urban areas, and growing signs of affluence, but the nature of tourism has changed as travelers seek out cities, buildings, refineries, and social institutions as tourist sites. Woolson's tourists, guided to the new city hall built after the Italian order of architecture, are visiting at a moment when the natural sites are giving way to the built, when the nation is being reimagined, and when the process of site sacralization, the collective sense of what sites must be seen, is adding new locations to the tourist map. When they visit Milwaukee, the best harbor on Lake Michigan, the tourists take in the courthouse, opera house, the Plankinton Hotel, and the National Asylum for Disabled Soldiers. The National Asylum, built for casualties of the Civil War, was home to 600 men, not a hospital, a prison, or a reform institution, but apparently a place where visitors could poke their heads into the private lives of the nation's wounded. Unable to realize the productive potential of their travel desires, Woolson's self-centered tourists also focus on their own comfort. The female tourists shop in search of new patterns of worsted work and dream of the cheap goods of Canada, gloves, collars, and ribbons. They enjoy the food offered them on board the ship and engage in shipboard flirtations. Cast as consumers of pleasure rather than travelers who seek knowledge of others and themselves, Woolson's travelers exemplify the kind of self-centered and ignorant tourist that Mark Twain had satirized in Innocents Abroad. While it is tempting enough to poke fun at a group of tourists as if they are a separate breed, they are, after all, people. McCannell writes that the tourist is an actual person, or real people are actually tourists. At the same time, the tourist is one of the best models available for modern man in general. The tourists on board the steamer Columbia, as its name suggests, are models of Americans in general and represent the emerging post-Civil War American society. If that is so, then the America they represent is one that is interested in the built environment and consumption, in viewing the pollutions to nature and the wounded men, shopping, eating, and flirting. Nostalgic for a lost past, a cultural community in harmony with nature, Woolson uses the Jeremiadic travel narrative to lament the destructive forces of patriarchy and capitalism. While Round by Propeller criticizes the deleterious effects of progress on the environment and the self-centered ethics of use, in The Ancient City, Woolson uses multiple voices to satirize careless, patronizing attitudes toward history, place, and others. Confronted with evidence of 300 years of conflict in Florida, the winter sojourners of her travel story often disregard the historical memories they are meant to preserve, including the recent Civil War, as they pursue their own intrigues. As she takes her troupe of travelers to the usual locations and rehearses the accepted history of place, she demonstrates how her visitors corrupt the sacredness of the sites with their antics and attitudes. Satirizing her sightseers' personalities and actions, Woolson draws attention to the tourists in ways that expose the ethics of sightseeing and of the society they represent. Published in December 1874 by Harper's New Monthly Magazine, The Ancient City recasts the gaze and complicates voice to throw new light on the structure of historical reality and historical knowledge. I'm quoting this from Maria Cotera. Told from the perspective of Woolson's female narrator, Martha, the narrative listens to the voices of others, attends to their nuances, and challenges complacent claims about place, history, race, and gender as it follows the 8 northern tourists on sightseeing excursions around the city. One conversation that illustrates how Woolson unsettles the travel sketch and assumptions about tourism comes when the group gets into a discussion about the 1837 escape of Coacuchi, or Cucci, the chief who was held prisoner in Fort Marion during the Second Seminole War, 1835 to 1842. Aunt Diana confuses the chief's nickname, the Wildcat, with an actual cat. Sarah confuses the chief with Osceola, his companion in escape. When Captain Carlyle explains that he was the son of King Philip, Iris confuses his father with the King Philip of the New England Wampanoags. Sarah references the immortal Pontiac of the West and something about the Caloosahatchee, which reminds the captain of the songlines with the hoochie coochie coochie, and reminds Iris of her brother who plays a song on his banjo. Superficially entertaining, such banter exposes the tourist's historical ignorance and their apparent delight in it, and prompts disconcerted readers to turn their focus on the thoughtless travelers. In between these linguistic feats, the captain and Iris keep disappearing together in flirtatious rendezvous around the fort, Iris proposing that they dance on top of the fort, as the narrative's love plots intersect with and disrupt the informative travel narrative and the history it recounts. As the gang explores the various locales of St. Augustine, Iris flirts not only with the handsome captain, but also with Mr. Mokes and with Mr. Hoffman. Miss Sharp pairs up with both the professor and Mr. Mokes. At almost every location, couples wander off figuratively and literally from the historical narrative. Though Professor McCoy and Hoffman provide some needed information about St. Augustine for the travel narrative, their racist and sexist attitudes open them up to Woolson's quiet satire. For instance, after Hoffman has given a quick historical account of the Minorcans, he comments on their physical appearance, noting the dark almond-shaped eyes, now and then a classical nose, often a mass of oriental black hair that do not meet his standards of unified beauty, leaving them metaphorically dismembered. When he remarks that the Minorcan girls remind him of Greece and Italy, Sarah wistfully comments that she's never been to Italy. though he does not say anything about her lack. Quote, the reflection of an inward smile crossing his face suggests his condescension toward the less traveled Sarah. Woolson also satirizes what we may refer to as mansplaining, a sexist mannerism employed by some men to demean and discount women's knowledge and intellect. When the group is discussing the Coquina seawall built in 1842, the professor cites facts about it, but does not understand, as Martha does, that the growing town may need the wall's protection. To her statement, he replies, it will never be anything more than a winter resort, Miss Martha. In these instances, Woolson satirizes the sexist attitudes and microaggressions of men like the professor and Mr. Hoffman. These instances demonstrate that as a woman, Woolson can appreciate the need to hear alternative histories and knowledges to give voice to the silenced and voiceless. When Martha comes across the monument for the Confederate dead and gazes upon the broken shaft made of the native concrete, an old Negro leaning on a cane pauses nearby. She engages in conversation with him, asking if he knew any of the 44 men whose names are inscribed. He answers that he knew them and that his old woman used to take care of some of them when they were babies. When Martha comments on the changes for Blacks with the Civil War, he straightens and says, yes, we's free now. I breathe another breath ever since, Mistress, that I do. While the material circumstances of the elder man's life may not have changed much, his sense of freedom is real. By contrast, one of the other visitors at the boarding house announced later that evening, they do not quite know how to take their freedom yet. By complicating the meanings associated with the monument as a memorial to both the Confederacy and emancipation, Woolson undercuts simplistic ideas about slavery, the relations between master and slave, and the meaning of freedom that her readers and tourists may have. Despite this visitor's assertion that the colored people of St. Augustine were isolated and well cared for and led easy lives, the African Americans the narrator encounters are proud of their freedom in ways that the northern tourist does not understand. The woman thinks their ideas take the oddest shapes. However, when the boarding house's Black employee, the Saber, insists upon going and coming through the front door, and Aunt Vinnie names her daughter Victoria Lincoln after Abraham Lincoln, they assert their mobility and citizenship in quiet acts of defiance and equality. When Sarah looks wistfully to the Nile for a breath of Africa, Martha understands that Africa is here in St. Augustine's Black section of town. Appropriately called Little Africa, it signals the residents' connection to the ancestral home and their own sense of community. It is also a place to which Martha must be guided, lacking not only knowledge of the route, but also Aunt Vinnie's intimate knowledge of place. When Vinnie says, whenever I wants to go, I just goes, she insinuates she has something that Martha lacks, an intuitive cognitive map of place. When Martha cannot find her way to Africa, Woolson positions her as an outsider and Aunt Vinnie as the insider. When Sarah desires an unobstructed view over the ocean to Africa, Woolson positions her as someone who ignores the realities of a past that haunts the racial memory of St. Augustine's Black community. Doing so, the ancient city reveals the gaps in knowledge and perception that characterized her tourists. In another episode, Sarah and Martha discover a young Arcadian family living without middle-class comforts. The house is more like an outbuilding. The dining room is situated out of doors, and there was no window of any kind, no floor save the sand, and for a door, only an old coverlet. At first, readers are drawn to what the Arcadians lack, but then catching the tenor of the place, Sarah ventures, they seem happy enough. The couple do not work much, living primarily off the land, and they do not intend to send their young boy to school. Readers can see that Sarah and Martha judge the family for what they lack: a nice home, steady work, education, ambition. But then the young woman turns the scorn on the tourist. She does not want to be like the women who visit the South, and she calls the men wimpsy. Pondering the meaning of wimpsy, Sarah sees Mr. Mokes giving Miss Sharp a lesson on St. Augustine and observes, he is certainly limpsy, then why not whimsy? As the Arcadian Anita rejects Northern definitions of manhood for her more virile Gaspard, Woolson shifts the gaze from the Arcadians to the Northern tourists as both Anita and the narrative question assumption about progress, knowledge, and Northern consumerism. In this way, Woolson poses an ethics of sightseeing that both critiques the careless tourists and demonstrates a more nuanced understanding of the relations between sightseer and attraction. Here, the local residents like Anita, Aunt Vinnie, and the elderly black man. Deploying multiple layers of storytelling, perspective, and voice, Woolson constructs an ethics of sightseeing. When she pauses the plot to listen to the people who populate her story, the travelers with their microaggressions and the locals who form part of their tourist experience, readers hear the personalities of both her travelers and the attractions. Giving voice to the Arcadians and African Americans, Woolson casts them as subjects with their own experiences and perspectives rather than as objects of the tour, attending to the nuances of her subjects and letting them talk back to the Northern travelers. She points to alternative experiences of place and history and to an ethics of inclusion and empathy that extends beyond the usual activity of sightseeing. Thank you. All right, I'm going to X out my little slide. Very good.
Thank you, Susan. It's fascinating. All right. So Susan, we still have your screen, or I still have your screen up.
Okay. Oh, well, here's where I'm the one who's not adept.
Okay. Kathryn, do you have, oh, there we go. Kathryn, do you have slides?
Yep.
Okay, terrific. So that should help. And okay.
Stop my video. Okay.
Wonderful. Okay, our next presenter is Kathryn Klein. And Kathryn is a lecturer in English at Kennesaw State University, where she also teaches women's and gender studies. Kathryn studies queer 20th century transatlantic fiction with an emphasis on mid-century and modernist eras. Today she's going to be focusing on the road narrative in US literature. Kathryn's also an award-winning fiction author under the pseudonym Charlotte Green. I have to admit that as soon as I saw that, I started going into Amazon and looking for those titles. So everyone can go and have some fun on Amazon after our panel, checking out Kathryn's many titles. So Kathryn is going to talk with us today about liminal seduction, movable queer spaces, and focusing, as I said, on the American road narrative and queering the road narrative. So Kathryn, welcome, and let's hear it.
Great, thank you so much. Can you guys see my screen? I actually don't use Zoom a lot.
Yes.
I can.
Okay, great, thanks so much. All right, yeah, this is part of an article I'm working on. Actually, since I submitted this panel last year, I've done a little bit more with it, but it's kind of a work in progress for an article. So yeah, this is Liminal Seduction, Moveable Queer Spaces. The road trip narrative is a quintessentially American form of prose. From John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath to Vladimir Nabokov's Lolita to Jack Kerouac's On the Road, the fictional and semi-fictional representations of American highways and interstates offer a place in which male characters undergo transformation and assert their masculinity. The car becomes a literal and metaphorical vehicle in which they can assert their dominance over a vast landscape, a machine that will carry male heroes to their final destinations and destinies. Traditionally, these explorations of masculinity not only exclude women, but female subjectivity more generally. If they appear at all, female characters in the road trip narrative function almost exclusively as sexual objects for the gratification of male heterosexual pleasure. This is perhaps not surprising when considering the notion of separate spheres for men and women. The idea of separate female-male spaces had a significant revival in the 1950s with an emphasis on female domesticity, but there are echoes of it throughout the 20th century. At the same time, leaving home presents different problems for the female driver at all times, both in terms of physical and sexual safety, as well as metaphorical differences. Sidoni Smith, for example, who explores women travel narratives, asks, quote, if traveling, being on the road, makes a man and makes masculinity and its power visible, what does it make of a woman who is at once a subject as home and a subject at home, end quote. Male-centered road trip novels avoid this question altogether by focusing on the pleasure and movement of men from place to place. Women are not people in these books in so much as they are another vehicle for male pleasure. My presentation today will examine exceptions to this paradigm, road trip narratives about women. My focus today is on early and 20th century road trip novels from the 1930s and 50s. Novels, I would argue, that develop at the birth of the road trip genre rather than at the apex at the end of the century. I also want to approach the topic of the road trip narrative from a queer perspective by looking at 3 lesbian novels that have gone understudied. Tiffany Thayer's 1930, 13 Women, Lillian Brock's 1935, Queer Patterns, and Patricia Highsmith's 1952, The Price of Salt, which has since been retitled as Carol. These lesbian narratives posit an alternative paradigm for the iconic American road trip story because their subjects are female and queer. My presentation today also explores how the American road trip temporarily allows for the representation of a lesbian escape from the confines of heteropatriarchal gender norms and domestic constraints. As opposed to the heterosexual male indulgence narratives I mentioned earlier, in Thayer, Brock, and Highsmith's novels, the road trip functions as a radical act of queer self-preservation and invention. Thayer's 13 Women is a mixed prose and epistolary novel that follows the lives of a group of sorority sisters, 13 of them, each of whom is gradually killed off in what initially appears to be a quote-unquote Hindu curse. Of these 13 women is Hazel Cousins, a consumptive patient that at the beginning of her section has been forced to move with her mother from New York to Denver for the curative dry air. Hazel is described as a stunningly beautiful ice queen, so chilly toward men they gossip that if you, quote, prick her, she'll bleed ice water, end quote. Things become more overt when the character of Martha Viborg is introduced. Martha is the wife of Hazel's lung doctor, tremendously rich and more obviously queer. Martha is first described as having a, quote, drop in the bucket from the well of loneliness, end quote. And then if you still hadn't caught it, Thayer begins to call her what she is, a lesbian, a queer, and finally the word he uses the most, a dyke. Martha pursues Hazel at once, and the 2 women begin to take car trips in and out of Denver together. Hazel writes in one of her letters that, quote, Martha takes me everywhere with her. Martha, as the owner and driver of a fine car, possesses the ability to bring Hazel away from her domestic responsibilities. Despite Hazel's illness, Hazel's mother is still very much hoping that Hazel will find a rich Denverite to marry, preferably from a respectable, well-known family. Martha and Martha's car, however, allow her to escape all of that. By spending time together driving around town and up in the mountains, Hazel does not have to search for a man. In the early stages of their relationship, Hazel's unaware of what her newfound feelings for Martha mean. She appreciates their friendship and she enjoys going places in Martha's car, in part to get away from her overbearing mother. The novel makes Martha's pursuit of Hazel seem like a seduction of an innocent, but it's also clear that this is nevertheless a consensual one. Things come to a fore when Martha begins driving Hazel up to her cabin in the mountains. On one of their later trips there, Hazel tells Martha that Mother's beside herself with curiosity. She insists on meeting a man here. Poor Mama, she'd so love to marry me off. Martha seems to take this as an invitation to begin their sexual affair, an experience so far outside of Hazel's understanding of the world that she doesn't recognize it for what it is. Reflecting on the experience later that day, Hazel runs away from her mother and hides in the local library. Again, the book makes it clear that Hazel's been so tremendously sheltered as to be unaware of the implications of what just happened between her and Martha. We're only told that, quote, Hazel thought it was beautiful. This is a little bit explicit, this next slide, content. But again, in case the reader doesn't quite grasp what is meant by it, the it in this phrase is made quite clear with this gorgeous explicit woodcut by David Berger. Regardless of whether the reader accepts Hazel's complete ignorance or innocence here, the affair itself is carried on entirely and specifically because Martha has the means to remove Hazel from her mother's domesticating, compulsory heterosexual influence, and that means is a car. While it takes some time beyond this first sexual encounter for Hazel to understand what is happening between them, Martha, figuring here as a career lesbian seductress, is well aware of what she's doing, and the narrator is clear several times to laud Martha's careful methods of seducing women. Martha understands the needs to distance her conquests from their domestic influences, and she uses her car as her method to do that. Here, as in the next novels I consider, the car becomes a means to remove a woman from a straight space to a queer one. In Lillian Brock's 1935 Queer Patterns, the car and the road trip are even more central to the development of a queer space for two women. The plot follows the career of a famous Broadway actress, Sheila Case, and her love affair with a lesbian playwright known only as Nikolai. Prior to the book's events, Nikolai has struggled to suppress her feelings for women, but like Thayer's Martha Viberg, Nikolai is well aware of what she is and where her sexual preferences lie. After auditioning Sheila for her new play, Nikolai, tormented by her attraction to the actress, would, quote, drive for miles alone, her short hair blowing in the wind, and ask God why in his otherwise perfect universe he had created women such as herself. Here already in one of her first scenes, the car itself is central to understanding Nikolai as a person. Unable to discuss her attraction with anyone in her day-to-day life, she makes her car a safe space in which to ask such questions both of God and herself. The car as a space of refuge continues to function throughout the rest of the novel. For example, when the two women have their first meeting together outside of work, planned ostensibly to talk about Nikolai's script and Sheila's part in the play, they drive into the country together in Nikolai's car. At this point in the novel, Sheila has also begun to struggle against her own attraction to Nikolai, and now finally in the car, she begins to accept it. The two women have dinner together in the country, and then afraid that she'll go too far and make a pass at Sheila, Nikolai turned the car toward the city, driving rapidly, seldom speaking. The city, as a representation of their so-called straight lives, does not allow a space in which they can be open with each other or others. Indeed, once they stop moving and begin living together in the same apartment in New York, the Broadway gossip mill will eventually drive them apart. After a 2-year separation, they once again find refuge with each other and on the road. This time, their travels take them on a kind of honeymoon south of Florida. Nikolai is described as a, quote, masterful driver several times, and it is she that makes the plans for the trip. Several times, the two women claim to long to, quote, leave it all behind and, quote, never go back. And it here they want to leave behind is their day-to-day lives. Their figurative and literal home that compels Sheila to masquerade as a heterosexual woman, Nikolai to stay single and closeted. On the road, they could be themselves, together in love. Their first stop is in St. Augustine, Florida. There, during a Christmas Mass in a small Catholic church, the two women make vows to each other in one of the first lesbian weddings in American literature. Kneeling together, exchanging rings, we're told, quote, Sheila, with eyes blinded by tears, found the hand of the silent woman beside her and in her heart made the blessed vows of fidelity. Weeks later, upon returning to New York and parking Nikolai's car, their love affair is brought to a disastrous end when Sheila is murdered by her demented ex-boyfriend. For Sheila and Nikolai, their life together can only be extended and protected somewhere that is not quote unquote home. Happiness continues only as long as they are on the road in Nikolai's car, passing from place to place. For my final example today, I want to explore the road trip in the slightly better known 1952 novel Carol by Patricia Highsmith, originally published with the title The Price of Salt and written under the pseudonym Claire Morgan. Highsmith's novel follows the gradual development of the relationship between the protagonists, Therese Belivet, a set designer, and Carol Aird, a suburban housewife. Therese and Carol meet while Therese is working in a seasonal holiday position in a large department store in New York. And almost immediately their affair begins entirely because of Carol's car. When they get together, Carol insists on picking up Therese in her car, in part because she says it's a quote rotten trip by train. Like the women in the two previous novels, the car becomes a space in which Carol and Therese can talk and relate to one another. As the liminal space between their two homes, Therese's artist hovel and Carol's monstrous mansion in New Jersey, the car becomes a place of seduction and self-identification. At the beginning of the novel, Therese, like Hazel and Sheila, does not understand why she's so attracted to Carol, while Carol, like Martha and Nikolai, understands her attraction entirely. Carol, however, seems more hesitant to act than the previous characters I mentioned, in part because of the wider age difference between her and Therese. Indeed, in many of their initial interactions in her car and at Carol's home, Carol's behavior towards Therese seems almost maternal, making sure she's had breakfast, had lunch, had a nap. The mother of a young daughter, initially Carol seems to treat Therese as a slightly grown-up version of her little girl. With her divorce still pending and her daughter in her husband's temporary custody, Carol decides to take a road trip to get away from her domestic worries. Therese's domestic life is likewise falling apart. Her boyfriend, Richard, is becoming suspicious of her time with Carol, and Therese eventually decides to break up with him when he calls her out on her crush. Carol's initially hesitant to ask her along, knowing perhaps full well what will happen, but she finally asks Therese, I was thinking, in fact, you might like to go with me on the trip. As soon as the women embark on cross-country in Carol's car on a journey that spans nearly the entire lower U.S., Therese, like Hazel and Sheila, is passive but willing passenger for most of the journey. After the relationship finally becomes sexual in a little motel in Waterloo, the power dynamics between the two women gradually begin to shift from something like mother-child or teacher-student to equals. This becomes most obvious when Carol finally teaches Therese to drive. Thereafter, while their daily destinations are still dictated by Carol as the driver, Therese has more control over the situation between them and gradually pulls out of her passive shell. Weeks into their trip, Carol and Therese discover that a tendril of home has chased them all the way across the country. Carol's husband has hired a private detective to follow them and make secret tape recordings of their affair. Carol's husband wants full custody of their daughter and is seeking evidence to help him with this claim. An affair with another woman will give him what he wants. Carol initially offers to send Therese home on a train to save her from the nastiness that's about to follow, but the women decide first to continue their road trip, desperately trying to reclaim the queer space they'd found earlier in their travels. However, as Carol is forced to look over her shoulder, the queer sojourn quickly devolves. The call of home and compulsive heterosexuality is too great for her. Finally, overwhelmed and worried that she'll lose her daughter forever, Carol is eventually forced to leave Therese and their car and head back home on her own. Therese, abandoned and forlorn, spends some time driving across the country on her own, the car and the road trip reminding her every moment of the lost love. In all of these novels, both liminal, moving spaces of the car and various destinations that passengers visit bring about a space for queer possibility. In all three novels examined here today, the road trip also functions as a radical act, a journey of self-discovery, specifically, in these cases, of sexual discovery and self-identification. Unlike their more famous straight male-centered cousins, the women in these novels have agency and presence, and the car and the road make that possible. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. Oh, sorry, Kathryn. Our third presenter today is Rachel Ravina. And Rachel will be very soon a graduate of Boston University's English Department PhD program. Rachel has successfully defended her dissertation and will take her degree in August. So I just wanted to spend a moment saying congratulations before we hear that work. That's wonderful. Rachel's work is primarily on 19th century American fiction, and her dissertation focuses on 19th century transatlantic peace reform movements, philosophical views of violence, and its representation in fiction, and critical race theory. Her article, There is an Indian Nature, Ethnography, Skepticism, and the Theory of the Peace Congress in Melville's Confidence Man, has recently been accepted for publication in J19. Congratulations on that as well. Today, Kathryn is going to share with us a work entitled Counter-Ethnography and the Politics of Violence in American Indian Travel Narratives. So, Rachel, let me spotlight you. Oops. Okay. And remove Kathryn's spotlight. All right, I think we should be good.
Okay, so I did just pop my little document into the chat if anyone would like it as a resource, if it's easier than looking at my screen, but I'll also share the screen. I just have a few passages that I think sometimes are easier to just look at. And I suppose my title is a bit of a deceptive title in the sense that the travel narrative I've ended up focusing on more recounts a peace congress. So politics of violence is involved, but kind of more the focus in the other two travel narratives that are less, central. So I will just get right into it. And yeah, so in my paper, I'm thinking comparatively about ethnographic travel narratives by and about American Indians. Focusing primarily on running sketches of men and places, an 1851 travel narrative by the Ojibwa writer George Copway, but also about moments in Margaret Fuller's Summer on the Lakes, 1843, and Harriet Martineau's Society in America, 1837. Considering their aesthetic approaches to representing, again, in Copway's case, peace reformers in Europe, and in Fuller's and Martineau's cases, violence in the American West. White and brown, atavistic and heroic, colonialist and necessary. My focus is on how specific forms of ethnography by these differently positioned writers do the work of creative reversal, resistance, and political critique while avoiding didactic modes. I want to think specifically about Copway's travel narrative in terms of the concepts of counter-ethnography, or ethnography that's by a subordinated or marginal subject about the hegemonic culture, as well as a little with Anne Goldman's closely related concept of localized autoethnography, or ethnography that encodes criticisms of the ethnographic scripts it appears to underwrite. So to begin, I just want to step back and briefly sketch a few other broad contexts important to understanding the significance of ethnography by and about Indigenous people in this period, to how reformers thought about Indian nature, violence, civility, sovereignty, and colonization. First, I'm relying on work by Oliver Eberl and a chapter called The Paradoxes of Peace with Savage and Barbarian Peoples, quote unquote, which sketches how Scottish Enlightenment discourses imagined a global order in which more civilized, peaceful, and philosophically developed cultures would replace cultures imagined as more atavistic, defined by a lack of advanced food production systems and property ownership. In Adam Smith's racist and patronizing framework, the savage, quote unquote, remains dominated by passions and submits to miracles or to the passions excited by surface appearances without the metaphysical insight that, quote, the things are not the proper objects, unquote. So in Smith's ideology, while Egyptians, Asians, and American Indians might advance out of the Hobbesian state of nature, they wouldn't achieve the philosophical insight that was, in Smith's view, a unique Western inheritance from ancient Greeks. The second framework I'm thinking with comes from Laura Mielk's really wonderful book, Moving Encounters, Sympathy in the Indian Question in Antebellum Literature, which posits that the explosion of ethnographic writing about American Indians in this period was gradually, sometimes only partially, complicating older, cynical, and sentimental caricatures from Enlightenment philosophers like Smith and Rousseau, and from American fiction. So ethnographic texts like Margaret Fuller's Summer on the Lakes help to unsettle tropes from brutalism and comments like this one here. They may blacken Indian life as they will, talk of its dirt, its brutality. I will ever believe that the men who chose that dwelling place were able to feel emotions of noble happiness as they returned to it. The whole scene suggested to me a Greek splendor, a Greek sweetness. I can believe that an Indian brave, bathed by such sunbeams, might be mistaken for Apollo, as Apollo was for him by the West. I do believe Rome and Florence are suburbs compared to this capital of nature's art. Fuller's romantic reversal speaks not only of her effort to lift American literature out of provincialism, her work is also deeply political as she aligns American Indian war heroism with that of classical Roman and Greek epic traditions, almost as though she's directly contradicting Smith's narrative that Indigenous Americans specifically lacked philosophical refinement from the ancient Greeks. As critics have noticed, Fuller sometimes reproduces other problematic tropes, especially the vanishing Indian trope, and she doesn't avoid romantic racialism, but her text, like many ethnographic works in the period, exceeds the descriptive conventions of Stoic and noble savage tropes. If white writers' ethnographies were unsettling scripts from Enlightenment philosophy, autoethnographic texts by American Indian writers like Black Hawk, William A. Pess, and George Copway offered forms of resistance to such scripts that were even more potent, even when suppressed, sometimes conforming to white expectations on the surface while also undoing them. Where one reader might read Black Hawk's famous statement, "My reason teaches me that land cannot be sold," for instance, as underwriting Scottish Enlightenment ideas of Indigenous subjects lacking a fully developed sense of personal property, or else see a translator's effort to recast Black Hawk in terms of the trope of the noble savage, we might also read a pointed moment of counter-ethnographic resistance. Black Hawk not only shows his capacity for reason and metaphysical sense, but he debates the terms of deciding about who has it, suggesting that white settlers' materialism causes them to misread the nature of reality or the reality of nature. While George Copway's travel narrative is not specifically focused on the question of Indian violence, it speaks to the pressures of assimilation to white European concepts of peace and civility, and demonstrates how a figure like Copway could seem to assimilate to European hegemonic perspectives and simultaneously undermine them. George Copway, Ojibwa writer, friend of Longfellow, and inspiration for Hiawatha, was also the only American Indian ever invited to speak as a delegate for the American Peace Society to one of a series of international peace congresses in Europe. Critics already consider Running Sketches, Copway's account of this trip, to be ethnography, more specifically autoethnography or ethnography with autobiographical features. His text is pervaded by an authoritative ethnographic style, includes empirical accounts of Ojibwa culture, and engages with contemporary ethnographers' common debates about human origins, nature, and classification, as when Copway claims common ancestry for American Indians with Persians before the flood, intervening in the common pseudoscientific debate that white ethnographers often had over the question of whether God had created the different races of man differently at different times, polygenesis, or whether Adam was father to all, or monogenesis. Copway sometimes adopts the objectifying language of ethnography made about racial others by and for white readers. When reflecting on the meaning of his participation as a peace delegate, he uses phrases like the Indian mind and implies that European art and civilization are edifying and superior, as in his comment, "What a change. Not very long ago, I heard the war cry of the West ringing in my ear. The war whoop has died away in the song of praise to the Great Spirit. Art, science, literature, like 1,000 streams, purify and refine the Indian mind." But as well as being autoethnography that sometimes reproduced paternalizing tropes, Copway's text could also be considered counter-ethnography. Copway uses tropes from romantic racialism, but also flips them so that white Europeans look like the atavists. In the early chapters of Running Sketches, for instance, Copway condemns the, quote, spirit of hero worship, unquote, that inspired atavistic white Americans to build the Bunker Hill Monument, and wishes for a future when a similar tower might be built to the Prince of Peace. He also comments disparagingly about the English, quote, doing evil, unquote, in Birmingham, a center of military industry and musket manufacturing, occupying the role of a privileged outsider with a sophisticated cosmopolitan moral vision superior to that of the European cultures he critiques. At times, Copway's travel narrative does something like Goldman's localized autoethnography, appearing to conform to dominant scripts while simultaneously undermining them. In one sense, Copway acted the assigned part, winding from indictments of war to praises of the unlikely trio Schiller, Goethe, and Longfellow. Copway delivered his anti-war, pro-sovereignty speech in full Ojibwe dress to curious crowds, finishing by presenting the president of the Congress with a peace pipe or calumet. The performance was a rebuttal to the most racist visions of indigenous atavism and violence, while also being a self-exoticizing gesture of assimilation to white European expectations. But the subtlety of Copway's narrative about the Peace Congress also makes available an even deeper form of resistance to white scripts, even those of sympathetic reformers. Copway appears to embrace his exotic position as an enlightened noble savage and Christian Indian pacifist minister in the eyes of majority white readership, but he also resists occupying the role of exotic object by becoming the ethnographer of the white Europeans of the Congress. He acts as a sophisticated critic at some remove from the other speakers and displays both his self-conscious relationship to his own racialized reception and his ability to anticipate skeptical readers' critiques of the peace movement. Copway, in this sense, embodies Donna Haraway's insight from the intersection of descriptive ethnography and ethics. Knowing their own knowledges to be marginal, the subjugated are less likely to succumb to the illusion of universality or objectivity. The idiosyncrasy of Copway's account makes it anti-ideological and anti-universalist, even as he argues for universal peace. His claim on Indian representativeness is performative only, and his romantic, philosophical, critical account is fundamentally at odds with the reductiveness of the white Christian peace reformers he captures in his text. For instance, Copway lightly satirizes the arguments of one Scottish speaker whose, quote, face is worth all the speeches we may hear today. So indicative is it of kindly feeling, lightheartedness, and hearty good fellowship, unquote. Although his arguments are less compelling, such as, men were not made to fight, seeing that their fingers are not adapted for tearing. Copway comments that even if the Scotsman's reasoning be not incontrovertible in the cause of universal peace, we still like war the less, if only because it is so repugnant to him with whom on any point whatever we should be sorry to be at variance. Then Copway compares the cheery Scotsman with questionable logic with some of the German speakers at the Congress, whose methods of argument were dominated by abstract principle and philosophical rules. Similarly, when Emile Girardin speaks, Copway notes that he, quote, contrasts strangely with the primitive look of many of his fellow orators, unquote, tying the racialized word primitive to white Europeans. Copway concludes that, quote, the Peace Congress afforded much matter for thought, since one could here study to advantage the distinctive features of the different nationalities. Copway is clearly working to recapture a reading public uncertain if it can put its confidence in a narrator too taken with these starry-eyed visionaries, as the French reviewers called them, as he adopts a privileged vantage point as critical ethnographer to evaluate the arguments and characteristics of these tribes of white European metaphysicians. So Copway performs at the Peace Congress self-consciously as a public pacifist symbol, but in his own travel narrative, he offers himself as a clever, humorous, and objective ethnographer involved in an imaginative affiliation with skeptical readers, and as a subject who cannot easily be made an object of white curiosity. Even so, Copway's reception was limited and mediated by prescribed conventions white readers and reformers expected to consume. One German correspondent called Copway's peace pipe a, quote, symbol of reconciliation from the sons of the Red Cane, unquote, following Copway's own oracular claim, quote, I am the first of my race to journey all the way from America's wilderness in order to assist in establishing peace over here, unquote. The following review also captures some of the flurry of interest and skepticism trailing Copway's speech. Critical people refer to this Peace Congress as a comedy. Yes, it was a comedy, but an imposing one. I can't make up my mind whether this Indian with his colorful trappings and peace pipe was still a child of nature, or whether he was only playing a comic role for us. But at least I do know this, that we ourselves did not play a comic role when in those sparse moments and in the presence of brothers from all regions, we allowed our sentiments for an eternal humanitarian idea to well up. A more troubling German review included a front page caricature of the, quote, retired savage and cannibal, offering a Bavarian-style calumet to a municipal official and promising to refrain henceforth from regarding any white man as potential beefsteak. For this reviewer, Kapwe was not a harbinger of the zeitgeist of Enlightenment humanitarianism, but a cannibal disguised by the Peace Congress's public farce. Kapwe's appearance at the Peace Congress became a public site of hermeneutic struggle. It welcomed skepticism, propaganda like this, mimicry, sentimental enthusiasm, politicization, and creative reversal in publications long after the event. In an 1853 issue of the National Era, a poem by Constance hails Kapwe as a chief from the far forest land who has traveled o'er broad Atlantic's foam, where sages of peace to their council come. These sages of peace, the sober cohort of New Englanders and European visionaries, once worshipped the war fiend, but now bring tidings of a Christian pacifist's or a utopian reformer's jubilee. While there is nothing remarkable about Constance's use of conventional romantic racialism to portray Anglo-Saxon culture as barbaric, it is notable that Constance uses racialized ethnographic language to describe the white Peace Congress delegates as tribal sages. Constance may have had a model for this kind of inversion, depicting white figures using such tropes in what we might now see as Kapwe's counter-ethnographic style. This is that poem. Even though they too could reproduce racist tropes, either unconsciously or in their effort to conform to the conventions of white presses in a genre for white audiences, emergent autoethnographic texts by American Indian writers like Black Hawk, William Apess, and George Kapwe produced a cultural sea change in that they made new forms of imaginative identification and reversal possible for white readerships. Reversals that even in subtle ways made it more possible to defamiliarize and recognize the atavism of white colonial violence and to humanize and relate to the perspectives of American Indian subjects. While she wrote her ethnographic travel narrative about the American West well before Kapwe was publishing, Harriet Martineau did write after Black Hawk and William Apess, and her text offers a compelling example of imaginative affiliation, reversal, and critique. Society in America describes an encounter with a colonizer from a Dunker sect in the American West, as well as discussing the explosion of land value with increasing colonization. The Dunker talks at length at Martineau about his pacifist religious sect. She relates, quote, the most profitable and delightful part of his communication related to his peace principles. He had gone through life on the non-resistance principle, and it was animating to learn how well it had served him, not only his consistency, but the force of his moral power over others, unquote. This discussion comes immediately after a section in which Martineau describes the encroachment of white squatters on dwindling Potawatomi reservation land in 1836. Martineau comments that she, quote, enjoyed hearing of an occasional alarm amongst the squatters caused by some threatening demonstrations by the Indians, unquote. On one of these occasions, a deputation of Potawatomi went to visit a distant warlike tribe and returned, quote, painted and under hostile signs and declared that the Potawatomi did not intend to part with their lands. Martineau then critically describes the squatters' incredulousness at the perceived to be stubborn refusals of the tribe to sell their own land. This juxtaposition reveals a contrast between the exploitative colonizer represented as a non-resistant and the Potawatomi's nonviolent resistance, which, like William Apess's Smash P revolt, was so likely to be misrepresented as an aggressive tactic by onlookers or readers less sympathetic than Martineau. Dunkers and Moravians were just a few of the many strains of Christian pacifists who were common on the frontier. It was a Tunker Baptist minister called Jacob Albright, who at an intertribal meeting of groups that had come together in 1830 to hear Black Hawk urge the formation of a great war federation against the whites, gave a historic speech on Christian pacifism, convincing many Native attendees of the importance of following in the footsteps of the Peace Christ and effectively suppressing Black Hawk's efforts to unite these tribes in an act of collective resistance. Martineau's political critique is the most salient of the autoethnographic travel narratives I've considered here, in part because as a white European intellectual, Martineau is in a position of greater freedom to critique the violence of American colonialism and the bizarre cognitive dissonance held by pacifists on the frontier. Still, Martineau's approach to ethnographic thick description remains more empirical than didactic. She attends to her own curiosity and excitement and reaction of identification with the Potawatomi resistance and uses paratactic connections without drawing overt comparisons to allow readers to more proactively make their own critical conclusions about white colonial violence and land grabbing, white colonists' professions of pacifism, Native acts of creative nonviolent resistance, and their possible political misreading as acts of aggression. Fuller is working with constraints as an American female romantic writer, but is, like Martineau, also more at liberty than Copway to step outside of the demands of representativeness, and works in a slightly different way to rebut racist presumptions that Indian violence and resistance was atavistic, aligning it pointedly instead with the romantic and aesthetic emotions of rapture and awe she associates with classical Greek and Roman heroic traditions. Copway's curious text occupies a very different and very strange position as an autoethnographic travel narrative by a highly assimilated Ojibwe writer, far from representative, but representing the political question of tribal sovereignty in terms that had to be sympathetic to white pacifist reformers. Hence, instead of presenting sympathy with Native resistance, Copway draws attention to the atavism of Anglo-Saxon culture, to the evil worship of war in Birmingham or Bunker Hill, and humanizes the Ojibwe by aligning war rituals he once participated in with the pre-converted state of so many Europeans and Americans. Like Black Hawk's autobiography, Copway's text was limited and mediated by the expectations of white reading audiences, the strictures of genre, and the self-consciousness of being a representative figure, but we can still find moments of subtle but politically potent reversals that might be characterized as not only imaginative, romantic, and empirically rich travel writing, but as subtle counter-ethnography or localized autoethnography, reversing hegemonic scripts depicting indigenous nature as atavistic, even while appearing to conform to the expectations that were necessary to gain the sympathy of reformers for the cause of advocating political sovereignty. Thank you. Sorry, I kind of forgot to scroll down at the end here, but anybody that wants the document is very welcome to it. And I'll go out of the screen share.
Thank you. Rachel. So we have time now for conversation, question. I know that we have a small audience in addition to ourselves. And really thank everyone who joined us today. So I guess I will start out with a question while others gather their thoughts. I have a question for Susan. Susan, you mentioned that this is a period when built environments are beginning to be tourist sites, right? In the US, or at least attention is going to built environments, and that this is seems to be a significant shift. And yet this is also the time when the US is beginning to see a need to protect natural environments, right? This is the period when, as you said, is almost the exact same year, right, that we get the first national park, and the second national park, quick on its tail. And I was wondering whether this is something that the text itself seems aware of, this sort of tension in what is becoming tourism, right? In the sort of shifting nature of American tourism at this time, because I think of there being the sort of health tourism of the 1820s and 30s, with Saratoga Springs, places like that, and then the sort of nature wildernessy tourism emerging about this time. But you're saying it's exactly the same time that the attention to built environment tourism is happening. So I was wondering if you could speak to that a little more and tell us whether that's something the text itself addresses.
Yeah, so first of all, as you mentioned, this is part of a larger project. And what I had done was to organize the project in terms of travel to different areas. And so I looked at the Woolson on the heels of Margaret Fuller going out to the prairies, William Cullen Bryant going out to the prairies, even Kathryn Mariah Sedgwick, who had a very luxurious trip out on the first railroad to connect the East to the Mississippi. And so when you look at the trajectory of where the tourism was going, it was becoming more about the built environment chronologically. But there's a little, I was using let's see, there it is. This volume, edited by Victoria Brehm and Sharon Dean on Woolson's writings. And they included a poem about Detroit, in which Woolson talked, because she grew up in Cleveland, in which she talked about the old French settlements, the waving grain, the rivers, the lakes, and so forth, in a very sort of romantic kind of way. And so the poem is rather nostalgic about the past. And there are moments in Round by Propeller in which you can hear resonances of that nostalgia for a past when you could go out on the lakes and the grass was the wheat was growing, and the life was simpler. And so there is a nostalgia in the sort of subtext of the Woolson, as well as you can see the trajectory of what kinds of things people were visiting as they went out to the Midwest. And I think one of the real charms of Woolson's two texts that I'm looking at is that while she deploys first person narrators, the narrators are not herself, right? And to get at her reading, you have to look at the subtle clues, the in-between spaces, the subtext. And I think that subtext, by focusing so much on the city, the built environment, particularly the pollution, she's suggesting the alternative. And when you look at the story, there are allusions to old Detroit, for instance, the old Canadian kind of Detroit.
I have to admit that this is text I don't know. I don't know either of these two pieces. So I'm at a disadvantage there. But I was also interested in what you said about the way that the voices of the locals are allowed to speak back to the sightseers. And it sounds like that is managed in part also by this distance that's created by a narrator who is not, you know, the author herself. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah. So that Aunt Martha, in this case, they're both aunts, right? Aunt Martha may make some comments that sort of sound like Woolson, but again, you've got to listen carefully to what's being said and who's speaking and the subtext to really get at it. And Rachel, I think we're both sort of playing around with the ethnography and who gets to speak and tell their stories. And so I think that ethnographic piece is a real important and complex piece in travel writing, how you describe the attractions, the other, and whether you let them have a voice. And there are those moments in the ancient city in which Woolson lets her others, the Africans and the Arcadians, have a voice.
Yeah, just kind of a follow-up comment trying to become a question, I guess. I love your talk, and I especially am really stuck on this sentence, the tourist is an actual person. I love this sentence, and I really appreciated ways that you were attending to both moments of kind of hilariously ignorant banter where it almost seems like the ignorance is the point, and that there's delight in the ignorance, and that's how you create a shared imaginary past in this post-war period. But at the same time, trying to attend to the ways that there's genuine nuance and complexity to these characters. It's possible I'm mixing up the two texts a little because I haven't read them either. So sorry if that's the case, but I'm wondering, yeah, how you attend to the tension between trying to find the humanization and nuance in these very dimensional characters, that they're real people. They're not only objects of satire, and simultaneously, they really are very funny, it seems, and they're like, you know, supposed to be objects of satire at the same time. So if there was any tension for you in trying to approach that. And
well, there's certainly this love plot in both stories, and I think in Round by Propeller, it's more to criticize the sort of thoughtless pairing up that happens on vacation, right? When in Vegas kind of attitude. But in the ancient city, one of the women, Sarah, seems to have a disappointed relationship with Mr. Hoffman that comes through in some of the nuances, that look that he gives her when she hasn't been to Greece and Italy. Most of the characters are stereotypes, I think. Sarah is a stereotype, but still a little bit more fleshed out. Both of the narrators are a little bit more fleshed out, a little bit more sympathetic, because they are presenting and sometimes commenting on the silliness of the other tourists.
It was reminding me very much of like, especially in the way that you were describing, the way that they're kind of critiquing what's happening because of tourism, of like naturalism. That's what it struck me as. And naturalist writing, it's always like almost like these stage pieces of people, to like, this person comments on race and this person comments on, you know, that to critique this big issue. That's
one of the things that was really upsetting to me, and I didn't have time to present it in this little short piece, is that St. Augustine is the first American city, right? And has this long history of violence with the Spanish, the French, the Huguenots, the British, the Native Americans, on and on. And there are these various forts that the tourists visit that have this history inscribed in them, and yet they're worried about flirting and the hoochie coochie coochie and so forth. And so you can see that dissonance when you read the text a little bit more fully. Yeah.
it was also making me think a little of like Nina Solberg, the Romance of Reunion, like post-Civil War narratives with love plots between Northerners and Southerners, and trying to kind of reconcile symbolically through those. So I found that like ways jokes were mediating the tension of Northern and Southern different ideas of masculinity as a really interesting feature too that you were talking about.
Yeah,
Yeah.
And one of the things I've tried to do in this book is to pair up the more clearly travel narratives with some more creative things. So I also looked at some of the Woolson's other short stories. And so on the heels of Round by Propeller, there's a short story, Jeanette, in which it seems that the Boston doctor is falling for the Native American or the Métis woman, and that she may go with him to Boston, and he's going to reform her into a Boston lady. And yet she chooses a native to live with, much like Anita has chosen Gaspar, the Arcadian, and they're living in this sort of, non-middle class place. And I think this is where she's sort of disrupting ideas about North-South relationships or even East-West relationships. The short story Philippa is also kind of interesting about relationships and love choices that the native indigenous characters make, as opposed to what the tourists from the North think of them. Yeah.
I have to add this to my reading list.
They're delightful to read. I mean, she's trying so many things at once, because it's a travel writing, so she's got to take her reader to these various sites and give us some history about Fort Marion and about Cleveland and these kinds of things. And yet she's done it by using these fictional characters rather than being first person narratives like most travel writing is.
So I also had a question I wanted to ask Rachel about this Ojibwe sort of embodied traveler, right? You said Copley is always performing his very Ojibwe-ness, right? And moving that Ojibwe-ness, but like to new places and new contexts, right? But then also attempting to perform a sort of acceptable, role of this Christianized, he's a minister, right? And you mentioned that he winds up both falling into and critiquing a lot of this sort of romantic ideals. But to what extent does he address, or does he ever address that sort of physical, his own physical presence and the ways that he's being read, that he is being seen? And I'm wondering if he ever writes that, this awareness of his own being seen, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a really wonderful question, comment. I think I like Kapwe because he's just such a bizarre character that just doesn't fit into any like easy reading. I mean, he's an Ojibwe sovereignty advocate, but it also at times he's kind of casting his own people in ways that seem a little bit like paternalizing. He is a minister. He's eventually excommunicated. He's an alcoholic. Like he's a peace reformer, but he's also one of the first people to meet with Kossuth, this Hungarian revolutionary that the peace reformers had a lot of issues with, and like wrote their members warning them not to be swept up in the Kossuth mania. And Kapwe met with him, and then later on, very troublingly, which like isn't part of this paper, but Kapwe became part of like nativist groups that were xenophobic at the same time that he's advocating for tribal sovereignty. Like it's kind of a mess, and Kapwe is just kind of all over the place, but he's so complicated, and his travel narrative is just really beautifully written and very kind of easy to get absorbed into. And as far as like his awareness, self-consciousness, I think that you can just see the contrasts in like his speech does feel very oracular. Like, I am the first of my people to come and assist you European people making peace over here. And he kind of adopts the performative role and is wearing full Ojibwa dress. So you're right. I think I can't think of a specific moment in the narrative when he thinks about his physical presence or reception or his like physical differentness. Like I can't like James Baldwin in Switzerland. Like I'm not thinking of a moment like that. But absolutely, like I think where you feel the most sort of defensiveness of identity comes in when he's thinking about European art and philosophy. Like it does seem he's very well read in philosophy and very much wants to show readers that he's really versed in Schiller and Goethe, and like that. Yeah, so there's a lot of kind of richness there, and he meets with a pacifist philosopher who's quite famous. And yeah, so I'm not sure if I'm quite answering your question, but well,
it sounds like he's very aware of how he must be read, but that he doesn't really address that physical, his own physical presence directly. Yeah, but obviously very aware of what people are associating with that physicality and attempting to recast it by showing his familiarity and knowledge and belonging in a framework of that Western philosophy and tradition and so on. Fascinating. Yeah.
Definitely.
I want to dominate too much. I do have a question for Kathryn as well, if others don't. This panel, I think Kathryn, you were originally part of a different panel, which was about genre and questioning the genre of travel writing, right? And sort of pushing at the boundaries of what travel writing was and what is not, what it is not. And so you're going with the fictional road narrative here. And I was struck as you were talking about the car. And of course, I'm familiar with thinking about the car as a sort of transgressive space and as a mobile space and kind of place of privacy where young couples or queer couples or couples who are otherwise not trying to not be seen are able to carry out their lives. But I was surprised by how little attention place got in the novels you were presenting. And that may be about what you were foregrounding since you were focusing on mobility in the car. But the one place you did mention was St. Augustine. As you said, one of the first queer weddings, right, is in St. Augustine here in this novel. And I was curious, is the place important in that scene at all? And is place important in any of these? Or is it very much just about the escape from domesticity, surveillance, et cetera, that the actual mobile space of the car provides? I guess so. Place.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, I think I mentioned two places, St. Augustine, and I think that she really only used that, as Susan pointed out, as this sort of like, it's this big tourist destination in the first half of it still is, but in the first half of the 20th century, that's like like Niagara Falls or something. It's like where you go on your honeymoon. And so I think that it's important. They eventually end up in Miami, which I think there's supposed to be kind of some echoes there of like, even then it was sort of like a queer haven. But I really think in St. Augustine anyway, it's sort of supposed to be like, look, we're also like straight people who also go to St. Augustine and Niagara Falls. But otherwise, I actually don't think that the destination, it's the journey, not the destination. I think is pretty much, probably, I would imagine everyone's read Lolita, right? Which I think would be a good echo to all of these, which is that it doesn't really matter where they're going. He's just trying to escape with Lolita, right? And as pedophile, but maybe not a great echo, but in a similar way, it's just like they just need to keep moving in order for this spot to exist. But the car is something that I talk about in the article more. First, in the sense of like the history of women drivers, which I mean, we still have that sort of stereotype that like the man drives if there's a straight couple, and they still do kind of like women drivers is scary, right? But in the time period of these books, it's even more exaggerated that like, maybe a woman will know how to drive so she can go to the grocery store, but that's about it. So the fact that they're taking these long trips is quite, even that alone is pretty extraordinary. And the cars that they're driving are also, again, as say in the article, they were marketed for men, like a big Packard is what Carol drives, and it's not really like the smaller coupes that they were advertising for women. I think in terms of the place, maybe the car itself is important, but where they're going, yeah. Except to make kind of like a quick joke, like when they get to Waterloo and Carol and they first sleep together, it's almost like they've crossed the Waterloo whatever. So it's almost there's an echo of importance there, but I don't think that it matters that much.
So really a decentralizing of place.
Yeah.
I think that the car becomes the new place. It's a space in which they feel comfortable and find their identity, and whether the car is mobile or not, it is a place in and of itself, I would think.
Exactly.
And I had read Driving While Black about African Americans and the road, and one of the points was that because of Jim Crow laws, and the inability to stop at a motel or a restaurant and so forth, and the threat always going through particularly the South, is that African Americans apparently drove large cars because they're going to be spending the night in them, they're going to be eating food in them, and it might be a safer way of moving across the country than a smaller car. I don't know if that would be anything to think about here in terms of if these women are driving large cars, that it may become this sort of place of protection, a place of being in, I don't know, parallel ways with the African Americans in the first half of the 20th century. Just throwing that.
There's certainly an echo, and I do mention, so, African Americans used, was it Green Book? Is that what, the Green Book.
Green Book, yeah.
So there was a parallel version called the Lavender Pages, which was for gay people. But I think because lesbians aren't necessarily recognized as lesbians, even today, like my wife and I, it's like, are you sisters? Just two women doesn't maybe necessarily visually strike people automatically. I don't know that it's quite that, but yeah.
Just something to play around with.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. We do have another moment or two if we have any follow-up questions.
Rachel, in looking at 19th century American travel writing, the ethnographic question is so tense. And how are writers going to describe the other? And I was thinking about Francis Parkman, who went out west in the 47, 46, and lived with the Sioux, and at times wrote some very positive things and shared their culture and their beliefs and their stories, and yet at the same time he would use these really obnoxious racial stereotypes about them. So it was just a lot of this sort of tension and back and forth about the ethnographic presentation of others. I assume you saw that as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a great comment. And it's not that ethnographic writing was necessarily only unsettling stereotypes, it was also branding its own, right? Like there's all these pseudosciences and, thinking about the monogenesis, polygenesis question or phrenology. Like there's actually like a long phrenological analysis of Kapwe that I found that was really fascinating and bizarre and also troubling. So yeah, I think like thinking about ethnographic pseudoscience and also just appropriation. I mean, Kapwe was a model for Longfellow, and of course, like Longfellow is like infamous for all of his borrowing from lots of other ethnographies without crediting them, and definitely Kapwe as well. So it's a good like sort of counterpoint to like ethnography was exploding tropes, but also creating its own.
Yeah.
This is all travel writing. It seems, both disrupting assumptions and providing new representations of unfamiliar places, but then also becoming often providing the new dominant vision of a place. Right? Seems to be one of the dangers of the genre. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I've just maybe one more question about the queering the road. I'm like trying to form a question still, I'm sorry, but I think it's fascinating how in all of these narratives, it feels like there has to be like an extreme reason that pushes the romance forward. Like whether it's like an extreme illness or like a really demented, abusive boyfriend or like whatever it is, it seems like there's like such an extreme thing in this time period that has to push that forward, and the car is an escape in multiple ways. So I guess I'm just thinking about the car as both escape and entrapment, because there's this surveillance thing that's happening, and the ways that's that isn't, it's not quite a question yet, I'm sorry. Anything about like divorce and family as well, like I think that whole narrative is just really fascinating and kind of upsetting family structures and women are supposed to have the kids in this period, right? And like there's the surveillance and worrying about custody, and that sort of contrasts with this idea that lesbian relationships aren't typically like recognized, that it's funny that there is all this suspicion and sense of threat when you would think that it would sort of be invisible. If you have any comments in response to that, not question.
Yeah, no, I totally do. I think the main thing is that like the car, although it functions as its own space, you always have to go, you know, at some point you're going to park it back at home. And especially with the road trip, there's always a sense that there is an end point at which we'll turn around. And so despite being like its own space, it's connected to home. And I think that's particularly true with women who make the car, you know, like it's always about like having like all these major picnics and, you know, almost it's very domestic in the way that the car is functional, right? Like I've got my home in the car with me, right? And so, yeah, and you don't see that in male narrative novels like this, where, you know, they've got like this, I mean, in some cases, like an iron, right? Like I can't imagine Jack Kerouac carrying an iron in his car, right? To iron his ties. It's just very different. So yeah, it's like they can't quite divorce themselves from home, and so the car is home. I think more so than having a male novel.
That's fascinating to think about. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Creating a domestic space in transit.
Mm-hmm.
A home on the road.
Yeah, great.
Well, thank you all so much for these wonderful, fascinating presentations, and for your rich engagement, and for your flexibility as everybody struggled to find ways to come together this summer. I really appreciate that we've all had this chance to come together and share this work.
Yeah, thanks for making this happen.
I hope we see each other next year at the real live ALA, but this is a wonderful substitute, wonderful chance to get to hear some work. So thank you all so much.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Well done.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.